Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The referendum campaign, it feels tense, fraught, perhaps even on a knife edge this morning. Spooked by a tightening of the opinion polls, the Remain campaign is hammering home its message on the economic impact of a vote to leave the EU, with the promise or the threat of a gloomy emergency budget to follow soon after if that's how we vote. It's gone down like a cup of cold sick among pro-Leave Conservative MPs. Leave, meanwhile, want to show that they've got a plan for what the UK would look like after exiting the EU, even if they're not in a position to make promises given they're not in government. So, both sides today are claiming to have a pretty accurate vision of how events would unfold after our vote on Thursday. Joko has the details.
Yes, Andrew, both sides of the debate have been peering into the not-so-distant future to tell us what they think could happen soon after the referendum on the 23rd of June. The Leave campaign has published a Queen's Speech-style roadmap to show how the UK could split from the EU by 2020. They claim new laws could be introduced to end the automatic right of all citizens to enter the UK and to curb the power of EU courts. And they foresee a new EU-UK trade deal, which could be struck by 2020. They also say new laws could be introduced to cut VAT on energy bills and divert more funds to the NHS. So, that's the mysticism from the Leave side. But what are Remain seeing in the crystal ball? Well, Chancellor George Osborne warns this morning his first priority after a Leave vote will be a new Brexit budget. He's been joined by former Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling to claim that tax rises and spending cuts would be necessary to plug the £30 billion black hole in the public finances that he says would be caused by a vote to leave. The Chancellors predict there'd need to be a 2p rise in the basic rate of income tax, and even protected budgets like the NHS, schools and defence budgets would have to be cut. But such soothsaying hasn't gone down well with a growing number of Conservative MPs who've signed a letter this morning saying they find it incredible that the Chancellor is threatening to renege on his manifesto promises, and they're promising to vote down any such budget. This is what George Osborne had to say in the last 20 minutes.
Sharing a platform and arguing the same case for the first time. And it's quite simple. We have both been Chancellor as the economy has faced very difficult times. We know what happens when you lose control of the economy. We've both had to deal with the consequences of the public finances collapsing and the difficult decisions that the country then has to take. And today we're here together because we agree on this. A vote to leave the EU would do it to us all over again.
Well, that's the Chancellor, George Osborne. Let's speak to one of the MPs who's not been overly impressed by Mr Osborne's warning. He's Jacob Rees-Mogg, and he's in the central lobby of the House of Commons. Jacob Rees-Mogg, what's wrong with having an emergency budget? If there's a vote to leave, there will be big decisions to take.
The Chancellor basically needs to calm down and regrettably stop talking nonsense. That if we vote to leave on Thursday week, there is a minimum 2-year period in which we are still a member of the European Union. That Article 50 takes time to be exercised. So what he is doing in this hysterical suggestion of an emergency budget is ignoring the treaty provisions for an orderly departure of a member state. He really ought to read the treaties more carefully, and particularly an excellent report by the House of Lords European Committee, which sets out how Article 50 would work and underpins that the purpose of Article 50 is to avoid an economic dislocation both for the leaving state and, even more importantly from their point of view, from the point of view of other member states of the European Union.
But Jacob Rees-Mogg, many on your side for Leave have stated that there could be a short-term shock. There could be instability, and George Osborne is only saying that the government would respond in the event of a Leave vote, which he and other economic institutions have predicted would lead to some sort of meltdown.
The meltdown idea is a far-fetched one. that what most of the commentators have said is that there may be some instability in currency markets, but there is always instability in currency markets. This is par for the course in the financial system, that nobody would know the economic effects within a week or two of a vote to leave. So an emergency budget is really indicating a degree of panic. It's a very silly thing to say, quite honestly, and for the Chancellor to jettison conservative principles in favour of his Europhilia seems to me desperately unwise.
Right, but there was an emergency budget, wasn't there, in 2010 to deal with the financial crisis, so it's not as if you haven't had emergency budgets before. What's wrong with preparing for one now?
What happened in 2010 was that there was a new government that felt that a different economic policy should be followed. That was the reason for the budget, same reason as in 1979. Geoffrey Howe had a budget, same as in 1997. Gordon Brown had a budget when he came into office. When the governments change, there is always a budget because economic policy changes. That's not an emergency, that's a matter of routine.
Right. So, I mean, in terms of you and others signing to say that you would vote down that sort of budget, you're going to vote against your own government on something as critical as a budget?
Well, it's not my government, it's Her Majesty's, but I'm going to stick to the manifesto I stood on that said we would not raise income tax. Indeed, George Osborne introduced a law last year to make it illegal to increase income tax. And the economy is not going to react in the way he is saying. The forecasts are based on assumptions that no rational person would follow, and the Treasury assumptions are ones that he'd given away to an independent body until he decided he needed to arrange the figures to suit his political argument.
But you're prepared to basically vote down the budget of a Conservative government?
I would vote against a budget that broke the Conservative Party's manifesto pledges, and more importantly, a budget introduced out of spite to punish the British voters for not obeying the wisdom of George Osborne. It is the height of arrogance a week before a vote to say, if you don't do as I say, I'm going to punish you. I think it is very damaging to George Osborne's credibility as Chancellor.
Do you think George Osborne should remain as Chancellor if the UK votes to leave the EU?
It won't be a matter for me.
But what do you think?
Well, let's wait until we have the vote. But I think he's done a lot of damage.
You've been quite outspoken now.
He's done a lot of damage to his credibility, and he will have a hard task to rebuild it.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, Central Lobby.
You.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joko. Ed Vizzy, this Mr Osborne's punishment budget, if we vote to leave, it's crashed and burned on takeoff, hasn't it?
Well, I don't think it's a punishment budget. I think what George Osborne is doing is he's making a very important point, which is a point really that we have to get across, that we know that there will be an economic shock if we leave the European Union. Every credible analysis of the economy says that there will be a significant impact on our economy. This is really very serious stuff.
How big did the Treasury? How big did the Treasury say the impact would be?
George's budget proposal sets out the kind of changes you would have to see to fill that black hole.
How big did the Treasury? How big
spending.
did the Treasury say the impact would be in its short-term report? What was its central forecast?
What the Institute of Fiscal Studies.
No, I've asked you about the Treasury because that's your government's department.
What the Institute of Fiscal Studies.
Excuse me, I asked you about apples. You answer about oranges. Let me try again. Well, tell me what was the central forecast for recession in the Treasury short-term report.
What I'm telling you is that this budget that George Osborne is setting out with Alistair Darling is based on the Institute of Fiscal Studies estimate, which is a 20 to 40 billion pound impact on the public finances. And George has quite rightly taken a mid-range, 30 billion. If there is to be a mid-range impact on the public finances, this is what it would mean.
The Treasury said the economy...
to increase taxes, and it would mean having to cut spending.
The Treasury said that the economy would go down by 0.4% over a year. Now, nobody wants it to go down at all, obviously. But why does a reduction, a recession, and shallow recession, the shallowest since 1956, of 0.4%, result in this massive punishment in tax rises and spending cuts amounting to 30 billion? Explain that.
Well, you're using this word punishment. What George Osborne and Alistair Darling are doing, united together, the first time they've spoken together as one on a public platform, is to say there will be an impact on the public finances, and when a Chancellor sees the impact on the public finances, he or she has to act, and they have to make very tough decisions, and those tough decisions will include raising taxes or cutting spending.
I was trying to work out why this response would be required, given how shallow the Treasury said the recession would be.
In terms of the impact, you've seen, for example, Rolls-Royce today saying, talking about the potential impact on Brexit, one of our most successful manufacturing companies. You've seen BT yesterday telling its 80,000 employees the kind of impact that it would have. I think the real point here, Andrew, is, you know, you can bring up different surveys and say, well, what about this and that?
Well, I didn't. I only brought up the
Treasury.
Treasury.
Knows, the two key points are everybody knows there will be an economic shock. And what George Osborne is saying, the second key point, is that means there will have to be an emergency budget where we will have to address levels of spending and levels of taxes to get the budget back on track.
How would you get that emergency budget through? There's not a majority in the Commons for it.
Well, we've had the letter. I haven't seen all the names, but obviously
57 Conservative MPs described Mr Osborne's position as, quote, untenable. There is no majority in Parliament for this budget, therefore the budget wouldn't get through.
Well, what George Osborne is saying is this is the kind of budget that you would have to expect if we leave. I think it's a perfectly valid thing for a Chancellor, somebody who's been Chancellor for 6 years, who's seen us through an economic crisis. You know, unemployment fell again today.
Now,
a lot of what George Osborne has done.
Please address my
put the
point.
economy back on track.
You only have a majority of under 16. At times, it's only 12. 57 Tory MPs and rising regard this threat as untenable. They will not vote for it. They've warned you. Labour's not going to vote for it. I assume we'll find out in a minute from John Mann. You could not get this budget through. It's an empty threat.
It's not an empty threat. It's a credible example.
How would you get it through Parliament?
The kind of changes you would have to make if we left. Well, Parliament, if after a leave vote, if there is a, God forbid, a leave vote, Parliament will have to reconvene. The Chancellor will have to set out what he thinks the risks are going to be.
He won't be Chancellor, will he?
On the public finances. And then there will have to be a budget proposed by the Chancellor.
He won't be Chancellor.
And at that point, MPs will have to very much decide what their duty is. Is their duty to help get the economy back on track, given the economic shock of leaving the economic union? Could you explain the logic? Or is it simply to say, well, we're just going to be a roadblock?
Could you explain the economic logic? Or give me any major economist in the world would think this is a response. That if we are heading to recession as a result of leaving, which is the Chancellor's scenario, we're going into recession, what is the economic logic as a recession stares us in the face that we raise tax and cut spending?
Well, as I said earlier, the Chancellor is someone who's stewarded the public finances for the last 6 years. We see one of those results today with the 20,000 fall in unemployment.
What's the economic logic?
We've seen long-term unemployment fall significantly, and that's because he did get the public finances.
But what is the economic logic of raising taxes and cutting spending as we're heading into a recession?
I'm about to tell you, he balanced the budgets over the last 6 years, well, at least significantly reduced our deficit.
He's balanced the budget.
Significantly reduced our deficit because
what's the size of the deficit?
He had to raise some taxes. And he had to cut.
He slowed down the spending. He said he would. Excuse me, Ed Vaizey, you can't be allowed. You may be rewriting the future. We won't know till we reach there. But you can't be allowed to rewrite the past. He actually slowed down the spending cuts because we were in recession. And instead of balancing the budget by 2015, which was his promise, he gave us an £80 billion deficit. So I ask again, can you name any credible economist, because Remain is very keen to quote mainstream economists, who would think that slashing spending and increasing tax would be a credible response to a recession?
Well, no doubt economists might pile in after this, as they've piled in on this whole issue of whether we should leave the European Union.
Well, give me one.
And when I was last on this programme, you asked Kate Hoey to name any credible economist who could say that leaving the European Union would be good for our economy.
So you're bringing up Kate Hoey.
Well, I'm asking you.
I'm asking you.
Can you name? Believes that leaving the European Union would be good for our economy.
I'm asking you. Can you name an economist? Can you name an economist that thinks this would be a proper reaction? Don't try and filibuster. You did it before and it didn't go down too well. Just answer this question.
That balances.
Name an economist that thinks the Osborne's punishment budget would be the correct response. Just name one.
Well, you know full well over the last 6 years when George took decisions.
So you can't. Just admit
when George took decisions about cutting spending and raising taxes, organisations like the IMF told him he was playing with fire.
That's the IMF, and you're not calling aid of Remain.
They came round and said, actually, what George Osborne did was correct.
Let me see if I can get an answer to this question, because it would be a first. In the manifesto, you promised a referendum. You also promised more money for the NHS. You also promised not to raise VAT or income tax or national insurance. But you never anywhere said in the manifesto, but we can't keep any of these promises if you vote to leave in the referendum. So it was a false prospectus, wasn't it?
Well, the prospectus was to hold a referendum, which is a manifesto promise that we've
No, I've said
fulfilled.
that.
In terms of the current state of the economy and our ability to manage that economy with the situation as it is now, with us as a member of the European Union, trading freely with a market of 500 million, we can do the things we've done.
But you never told us that all these promises
might change.
But you never told us that. There is nowhere in the manifesto do you say that all these major promises are predicated on us voting, in your view, the right way on the referendum. That's
true,
isn't it?
Well, there are key issues in the manifesto that you can't foresee because, for example, David Cameron still had to carry out his very successful negotiation in Brussels.
You could foresee this because you promised the manifesto. It was in the manifesto.
Some of the key
you promised
changes
a referendum
that have secured our vision for Britain in the European Union.
John Mann, is there any chance that the Labour Party, whether it's on your side of Leave or majority for Remain, would vote for a budget like this post the referendum?
Well, as John McDonnell has put out this morning, no. This budget won't be voted through. It's not a proposed budget, it's a press stunt by George Osborne, and rather a silly one.
So John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, says Labour won't vote. Labour would be whipped against it, I assume. There'd be no rebels. I think we can take it for granted the SNP, which is the self-designated anti-austerity party, they would vote against it. Almost 60 Tory MPs and rising would vote against it. It's a nonsense. Ed Vasey.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were still asking John. I'm getting all the questions. Well, I mean, I've already made the point that this
you don't get it through, that's the point. How would you get it through?
This is an example budget. Well, the Chancellor would come to the Commons after a Leave vote when people would see the reality, if they, as I said earlier, God forbid there was a Leave vote, would see the reality, would see the impact on the economy, and then the Commons would have to take a view on whether it is important to get the budget back on track, to get the national finances back on track, given the new and very dangerous situation we're in.
John Mann, why was Alistair Darling associating himself with this morning?
Desperation, I think. Last attempt to shore up the vote. I'm hearing that even in Scotland, that the vote in many constituencies may well be going for Leave, even in Scotland.
That would be a surprise.
But that's what I'm hearing.
So
from people in Scotland.
Just to check though, Alistair Darling then was not representing the Labour Party this morning, to your understanding?
Well, it clearly wasn't. If it was someone representing the Labour Party, it would have been John McDonnell as the
So he was
Chancellor.
representing Alistair Darling?
He was indeed, and a very good man he's been, but, his judgment on this is wrong. And linking with this, it's desperate politics trying to build up this project fair even more. It's not working. And it's not working because it's nonsense. And this is kind of almost the classic illustration of what nonsense it is.
And yet the Chancellor this morning on the BBC radio implied that there was quite a consensus. It was a common view, and he used Alistair Darling's position there, of Labour and Conservatives said the same thing. We've just heard now from John Mann. Ed Vasey, I'm asking you. I know you don't want me to, but that's why I'm continuing.
I
feel it's a bit unbalanced.
Well, you're the one with the questions to answer at the moment. That he implied that this was a common view. He made the point of saying here we have a former Labour Chancellor, Conservative Chancellor. There is a broad view that this is what we would have to do. And we've now heard from the Shadow Chancellor that they wouldn't vote for this. It's as I said, I began by saying, it's crashed and burned on takeoff.
Well, I think what he was doing was standing with a Labour Chancellor in the last Labour government, when Labour used to win elections, who had to handle an economy in crisis following the banking crash. So I think Alistair Darling is a credible figure who knows what it's like when you're sitting in number 11 Downing Street and facing an economic shock. But he's sitting with a man who's looked at what George is proposing.
But he was not speaking for anybody but himself,
with my experience, this is exactly what I would expect. Look, I don't know what John McDonnell's position is.
We've just been told.
There is this peculiar.
We've just been told.
There is this peculiar mindset, I gather, from Jeremy Corbyn that he won't share a platform with the Conservatives. But the fact is, there is a united front across Labour,
but they won't vote for
the majority of Conservative MPs and the SNP.
That our economic future, they won't vote for an austerity
our economic
budget.
future lies in Europe, and that is a key.
But not
just
not vote for an austerity budget. If you look at what Jonathan Portes has said in the last
from the
hour,
NIESR.
He's an economist who is in favour with Jeremy and John McDonnell. I think it's fair to say. He's said, do exactly the opposite. If the scenario is what George Osborne's saying, do exactly the opposite. And so, in fact, the John McDonnell budget would be reflating the economy,
Right.
as opposed to
Well, let's have a
cutting it.
well, let's have a look at what the Vote Leave have presented today in terms of their Queen's Speech style blueprint, which I outlined a little bit earlier. I mean, one of the announcements includes proposals for a bill that would provide an extra £100 million a week to the NHS. Why not the £350 million that you've been talking about?
Well, I mean, Vote Leave aren't in power, and you know, one of the interesting things with this referendum is there's two debates going on. There's the Remain and Vote Leave battle on the media, of course, because they're the representatives, and there's the discussions that are going on in the rest of the country. And in the discussions in the rest of the country, all of this, frankly, is passing them by. They
right.
don't
So,
care.
do you think that this Queen's Speech style blueprint wasn't worth doing for Vote Leave?
I think that one thing that's certain is now that there'll be more money spent on the NHS
Right.
if we leave, because there's a consensus, perhaps for the first time.
But would
across
it be
the political
100?
spectrum.
But would it be £100 million or the £350 million that Vote Leave keep quoting as the amount of money that is spent and sent to Brussels every week?
Well, it all depends who's in power and who makes the decision.
Right.
There will
What
be
would
money.
you do?
What would I do? I would be looking to spend sufficient money, which would be under 100 million, on putting money back into the NHS, getting rid of the hospital deficits, recruiting nurses, getting nurses bursaries, even giving a pay increase in the NHS, putting money back into the National Health Service would be my priority. And if that money becomes available, that's what I would be.
All right, but you think this is an alternative manifesto, and at the moment they shouldn't be putting this forward. Let's have a look at Labour on immigration, because you've talked a lot about immigration. It does look as if Labour is panicking as much as the Conservatives. We've had Tom Watson, the deputy leader, now say there would be moves, proposals to curb the free movement of people. I presume you'd agree with him on that.
I've called for that. I called for it in the negotiations that David Cameron did. I called for it immediately after the election. I called for it in the last Parliament a lot. But the problem is that you can't do it because the European Union refuses to do it.
So on whose authority is he saying it?
He's saying it in terms of what's good for the country, and I agree with him.
But not the Labour Party, because it's
country.
not what Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell think, is it?
Well, you'd have to ask Tom Watson. I'm not privy to their discussions, but I agree with the principle of what Tom Watson and Michael Duggar and others have said. However, the problem with that is that the European Union rules don't allow it to happen. And so the issue for all of us is going to be, whatever the vote, what do we do afterwards on the Friday? And if it's leave, we have that opportunity.
Right.
Right, let's go straight over to the Commons now to speak to the Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Seema Malhotra. She is a vote Remain in the Labour Party in the central lobby. Seema Malhotra, let me come straight away. You've heard the Chancellor with his what's being called a punishment budget. If we vote to leave and the Chancellor came forward with a budget like that, would Labour vote for it or not?
Hi Andrew, we've been very clear that we won't be supporting a budget that sees cuts to the NHS, cuts to working people's support. We don't believe that a Tory Brexit and then an emergency budget is going to give people the reassurance that there's going to be a brighter future at all with Brexit. What we're saying, and we're calling on people today, with our opposition day as well, is to say that there is a brighter future if we stay in the European Union.
Right.
That is absolutely where we need to be for our
I understand that's your
prosperity
position. Can I just
for Britain.
clarify, though, that because Alistair Darling, former Labour Chancellor, appeared with George Osborne as the outline of this post-Brexit budget was announced, do I take it from what you say that Mr Darling was not representing the Labour Party by being with Mr Osborne on that?
Look, the context of this is very clear, isn't it, Andrew? This is the same warning that the IFS and others brought in, that there would be a hole in our
I asked
public
you about
finances.
Alistair Darling. It would be nice just to get an answer.
Yes,
Was he speaking just for himself, or
but
did he in
he's-
any way represent the Labour Party?
Look, he's talking in terms of how we would need to address, and the country would need to address, a hole in the public finances. But what we've been saying, and we've been very clear, is that we would not be voting for more cuts. So what we need to do, and the message that we want to give, is that if you want security and you want prosperity and you don't want to do self-inflicted damage to our economy...
You've said that. I'm trying to get an answer to my question. I'm not getting answers from Ed Vaizey, and I'm not getting answers from you. So please give some respect to our audience who are voting next Thursday. And let me ask you one more time. Was Alistair Darling just speaking for himself by being alongside Osborne, or did he represent the Labour Party?
We have said very clearly, Andrew, and I'll just say this again, the context
No,
of
don't
this
say
is
it again,
not
just
new.
answer the question.
No, but this is important. The context isn't new,
No, it's important
is
that
it?
you answer the question.
The context isn't new, is it? That the IFS have said
All right,
there will
well,
be a
you're not
black
going to
hole
answer
of
the
20
question.
to 40 billion.
I'm sorry,
the
Stephen
best
Malhotra.
way to avoid
I've had
this
enough.
is to vote for
You're
Remain.
not answering the question, so let's not waste our time with any more of this. I mean, is it going to go on like this? When is the referendum?
Next Thursday.
Couldn't come sooner.